Yeah.
That seems like if someone is wanting to avoid any accountability, but feel spiritual, that's very attractive to people, isn't it?
It can be, very much so.
But what we have to look at is what is the evidence that's out there.
That's
Just
right.
because someone believes something doesn't absolutely make it true. So if someone is trying to choose a worldview,
That's right.
how would what would you recommend that they look for or look at? Or what is a test?
Good, good. There are various tests we can give
Okay.
for worldviews. I'm glad
Okay.
you asked that question. The first question is to ask whether the worldview is logically coherent, whether it's consistent with itself,
Okay.
or whether it contradicts itself at some point.
Okay.
And my experience tells me that most worldviews wind up in some kind of logical conundrum at some point or another.
Okay.
For example, pantheism, or this New Age worldview, has several problems with it. For example, the New Age pantheist tells us that, that there really is ultimately only one thing that exists. This one thing, call it God, call it Brahman, call it the Absolute. There are various names for it, depending upon what religion you're looking at. But there really is only one thing, and this one thing is absolutely unchanging and undifferentiated, has no properties. You can't say it's this, you can't say it's that. Human language can't describe it. But as soon as you say you can't describe it, you're describing it.
Okay.
So you're already contradicting yourself.
Right.
On the other hand, they say this thing is unchanging and immutable and absolute, and yet somehow it fell into ignorance. Because if I am this thing, if I am this being, I must have forgotten that somewhere along the line.
Right.
And I have to perform various meditative techniques or yoga to reconnect with my inner divinity, right?
Right.
And so this immutable being becomes ignorant and then becomes knowledgeable. Well, now it's not immutable after all. And so there's contradictions there. So there are various contradictions and logical inconsistencies that you find with the pantheistic worldview.
Okay, kind of going in that same avenue, when you said contradiction, I took a class from Dr. Cowan, and one of the things we talked about was, I don't know if you call it the laws of thought. Would you just briefly describe the law of identity, the law of the excluded middle, and the law of non-contradiction? Because you mentioned contradiction there, and
Right.
why that is important. Why people need to know that.
Absolutely. Well, there are three basic laws of logic, or laws of thought. The law of non-contradiction, I think, is the most important one, which basically says that a statement can't be true and false at the same time and in the same sense.
Okay.
So it cannot be true that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and equals 5. It's one or the other. It can't be both, right?
Right.
Which that takes me to the second law, which is the law of excluded middle, which says that a statement must be either true or false.
Okay.
Can't be both, can't be neither. It must be either true or false. And the law of identity just says that a statement is if it's true, it's true.
Okay.
And it can't be different from itself. But the most important one is the law of non-contradiction. I think the other two kind of flow out of that first one.
Because the law of non-contradiction, a lot of times people systems or worldviews contradict themselves. Do you think they know that they do, or just ignore it?
Sometimes they're not aware of the contradictions.
All right.
Sometimes they just kind of paper over them and try to ignore them, hoping they'll go away.
Right.
But if they stop and think about these things very carefully, they'll see that these are some really serious problems.
Okay.
Yeah.
On that thought, I want to ask another very important question of where we live today. Well, Dr. Cowan, you said there were 3 basic worldviews, but you said there was a 4th one. What is that?
The 4th one is postmodernism.
Okay, postmodernism. Would you help us understand how we went from theism into that age of modernism and how we got to postmodernism? Would you kind of extrapolate that and help us?
Sure. Well, I'll have to be brief, but but basically in what's called the Renaissance period, and the beginning of what we call the Enlightenment, which started about 1600, AD 1600, with people like Francis Bacon, and then on into René Descartes and other philosophers during that period. There came to be something we call modernism, as you referred to it. And modernism basically began when there was some dissatisfaction with some of the theological debates that were going on during that time. and a lot of uncertainty was coming about because there were various different Christian factions vying for attention and supremacy,
Okay.
as well as the rise of this new scientific method from people like Bacon. And science was seeming to answer questions and beginning to give us knowledge that we didn't have before. And yet in theology, there were a lot of debates going on and a lot of uncertainty. And so modernism comes about as a result of this, where many thinkers began to believe that in order to have knowledge, we have to have absolute certainty. And there was the belief that science could give us that certainty.
Okay.
And so with this belief that knowledge requires certainty, theology and those debates were not giving us certainty, at least at that time, and then science seemed to be offering promise of certainty, modernism is born.
Okay.
And modernism is essentially the idea that, science has all the answers.
Okay.
And that science can give us absolute knowledge and certainty.
All right. Before we go down to postmodernism, you said something just a minute ago. Dr. Cowan teaches philosophy, and part of philosophy is epistemology. What can we know? How do we know things?
That's right.
And you just talked about certainty. You know,
Exactly.
what areas of life? I mean, there are a lot of things that we do in life we don't have absolute certainty for.
That's right.
And would you give us an example so we can just help the people to know that if they hear these things on A&E or the Discovery Channel, that
Right.
you know, it's not you got to have absolute certainty. There's a lot of things we do that we don't have absolute.
There are
certainty.
very few things we can have absolute certainty about.
Okay.
I would say the only things we can have absolute certainty about are basic mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4, that
Okay.
kind of thing, and the laws of logic that we talked about. Beyond that, there's very little we can have absolute certainty about. Certainty comes in degrees, and we can be more certain about some things than others.
Right.
But when it comes to having absolute certainty, there are very few things we can be absolutely certain about. And so you can already see the problem with modernism and the scientism that comes with it. Scientism being the idea that science is the only source of knowledge.
Okay, let me ask you a question about that. Scientism is almost a philosophy in itself, because someone would say, well, you can't prove God scientifically. And I would ask you, you can't, if God is supernatural, we can't use natural means to prove something supernatural. But how do these scientists, how do you think they try to hoodwink us and say, you know, you can't prove God?
Right. Well, I would want to ask them, what do you mean by proof?
Okay.
If by
Right.
proof you mean absolute certainty,
Okay.
well then you're right.
Right.
But I believe that there is nevertheless very, very good evidence for the existence of God.
Right.
Evidence that I think puts it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Exactly. Okay, absolutely wonderful. All right, we get to modernism. Is this about the time of Darwin, or does he kind of push us into postmodernism? Help us there.
Well, there's some steps along the way.
Okay.
We get modernism arising around 1600,
Okay.
and this quest for knowledge using science and scientific reasoning
Okay.
to find certainty.
Right.
And then Darwin comes along to kind of bring scientific investigation to bear on human biology
Okay.
and biological origins. And as a more contemporary scientist, Richard Dawkins says,
Right.
Darwin made it intellectually respectable to be an atheist.
Right.
Because Darwin now allegedly explains everything. He explains the origin of human beings.
Right.
Which is the one thing that was kind of left over, right? Science is explaining how the world works, all the mechanics of physics and things like that, and now we have science applied to biology, and now we can allegedly explain everything. We don't need God anymore. And so modernism now brings about this naturalistic worldview. Modernism provides now a basis with Darwin for atheism, naturalism, which says that all there is the natural world. That's a lot of stuff in a very brief time.
Right.
But
And a lot of people still believe that today, don't they?
absolutely.
Still today.
Yes.